and eventually school dropout. So this is what we mean by school to prison pipeline, that schools are literally becoming the path, the avenue, the gateway to prison. And it is the belief, it is my belief, that God has power to transform any situation. And so that has led the office, the national office, the black offices of ministry of the Episcopal Church to work on a rite of passage experience to help curb the school to prison pipeline. The question is, what can we do? What can all of us do to handle the situation and to change the reality? When we look at school situations as it relates to prisons, we know that for most prisoners, that 7 in 10 prisoners perform at the lowest literacy levels. And that we also know that there is a direct correlation between academic performance and the possibility of incarceration. So, I have a question for you. What is your opinion of crime in America or locally? What is your opinion of crime in Greenville? This is a question. What do you think? Terrible. What's that?
Very bad.
Okay. Anybody else? The state of crime, terrible, that it lacks a lot of things. That the state of crime in the U.S. is terrible. We have an opinion that crime is rampant, that crime is everywhere, that violent crime is up. So what are some of the numbers? So in 2009, just 3 years ago, 7.2 million people were at that time either in prison, on probation, or on parole. 7 million people. And also in 2009, that's the last data we have, 2.3 million individuals were actually in prison. So what we've seen, or what we see, is that incarceration rates have increased, while actually violent crime rates have decreased. That seems a little bit counterintuitive, because if the incarceration rate is increasing, we would assume that the violent crime rate is increasing. Simply not the case. Violent crimes are actually less now than they were a decade ago. So if violent crimes are increasing, then what do we owe this increase in incarceration rates? What we see is that drug-related arrests have increased steadily. So in 1980 in Newark, New Jersey, 8% of those incarcerated were incarcerated because of drug-related offenses. 1980. In 2003, 40% of people in the prisons in Newark, New Jersey were incarcerated because of drug-related offenses. And most of these who are in prison are not for distributing drugs, but for consuming drugs. I know when I was growing up, there was a lot of attention paid to this term, the war on drugs. That we have to fight the war on drugs. And you remember the famous phrase, just say no. The First Lady, when asked if a child is offered drugs, what do you recommend to this person? The First Lady says, just say no. Huge campaign. Well, we owe this term, drug on wars, to President Richard Nixon. He first gives us this term in 1971. So in 1971, we have this philosophy coming into being of war on drugs. We know 1971, Dr. King assassinated in 68. So it's right after that we see this phrase, war on drugs. And so we actually have this term, war on drugs, before there is actually a drug epidemic or a drug revolution. And so we keep this phrase, war on drugs. We still use it today, also, although I think a little bit less I think the term today is to be difficult or hard on crime. I think this is the phrase we say today. But we have this philosophy of war on drugs leading up until 1986 and 1988. In 86 and 88, we get the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. And it's really, when we look at prison incarceration rates increasing, we can trace it to this act of 1986 and 1988. Because in 1986, there were around 300,000 people in the penal system in the United States, 300,000. Now it is more than 2 million. So what we see is that our prisons are full of not people who are murderers, people who are stealing, people who are rapists, but our prisons are full of people who are mostly in for petty drug offenses. So we look at the U.S., and the U.S. has the world's highest incarceration rate. This actually surprised me. I thought a country like Russia, surely China, with some billion people, would have higher incarceration rates or higher incarceration numbers. Simply not the case. The United States leads the world in incarceration rates. And so when we look at who is in prison, we see that 1 out of 110 white men is in prison. We see that 1 in 15 black men is in prison. So black men make up about 40% of the prison population in the United States, even though blacks total about 13% of the U.S. population. And for Latinos, it is 1 in every 36 Latino, male Latino, who is in prison. So in recent years, we see that 70% of prisoners in the United States are non-white minorities, meaning that 70% of those in prison are either black and Latino. And in recent decades, we have seen this surge. I've already mentioned that in 1980 and prior to 1986, there were some 300,000 people incarcerated in the United States. Now we're more than 2 million. So since 1980, this rate has more than quadrupled. And some people feel, this is not by all the only philosophy out there, but some people feel that this increase is partially due to the mandatory sentencing that we find in this philosophy of having a war on drugs. That our prison rates are increasing even though violent and property crime rates have declined since the 1990s. So when we look at the war on drugs and we look at those in prison, we may assume that, okay, if 70% of those in prison are either black and Latino, then blacks and Latinos should use drugs at a higher rate than the majority population. I mean, this is sound reason. You have more here, then perhaps this is true on the outside. What we see is that when we study and we control for race, that really all ethnicities use drugs at the same rate, whether it's white Americans, indigenous, Native Americans, those are Asian brothers and sisters, blacks and Latinos, everybody in the United States, really, these people abuse drugs at the similar rate, both using drugs and selling drugs. However, the arrest rate for minorities is much higher than the arrest rate for whites. So this war on drugs has helped lead to the mass incarceration rate of ethnic minorities. So I've painted what the picture is like for our prisons. What does it look like for the schools? What we are seeing in the modern day is that schools are sourcing out detention to law enforcement. So I went to elementary school in the 80s and went to high school, middle school and high school in the 90s. When somebody messed up, when somebody got in trouble, there were a few options. You would go see the vice principal, who would then decide some disciplinary matter. And there were pretty much 3 choices. You got in-school suspension, where you were suspended but in school. You got out of school suspension, meaning that you went home, or you got some type of detention. These were the three options. But what we're seeing now is that there is another option, and that option is to call law enforcement. And I see this in Dallas quite a bit. If a student does something wrong, and normally it's not something that is life-threatening or, in my opinion, would warrant calling the police, but if a student does something wrong, then the principal or vice principal will pick up the phone and call Dallas Police Department. And Dallas Police Department will take this student downtown. The student is not arrested because the student is underage, but the student is detained. And what we're seeing is that students who are detained, even though technically, since they're a minor, they are not arrested, they are starting a record. And this starting of a record is one of the best predictions that we have of how students will go on the school-to-prison pipeline. So when we look at those students who are being suspended, those students on whom law enforcement is being called, we see that the suspension rates for black students in public schools is 3 times higher than those of white students. And so we believe that this begins the path from lockout to dropout. That students are being locked out of school, literally, because they're either being suspended or they're being detained at some prison facility in downtown Dallas, that leads directly to dropout. So expelling students from school is the most serious disciplinary option that's available for school districts. And what we're seeing is that school districts are using this at a higher and higher rate. Law enforcement is becoming part of out-of-school suspension and in-school suspension, and time again, many administrators are choosing the law enforcement route. So, detaining students downtown has a far-reaching impact because this discretionary expulsion of students for nonviolent crimes, nonviolent behavior is really leading them to eventually drop out. So how do we define this pipeline? What do we think this pipeline is? The pipeline is defined as the disturbing pattern of school disciplinary problems, escalating from suspension to removal to entering the juvenile justice system and eventually to dropouts. And there is a link between school discipline and dropout rates, and more than 80% of Texas adults who are in prison are school dropouts. 80%, 8 in 10. One researcher named Mark Cohen, who is a professor at Vanderbilt University, he's a professor of business, he makes this calculation. He said, if the United States would concentrate on education and preventing students from dropping out and preventing students from entering the school-to-prison pipeline, that the nation as a whole would save between $2 million and $3 million for every child who is diverted from the criminal justice system. And last year, I think the calculation was somewhere around between 18 and 19,000 who went through this. He says that the United States would save between $2 and $3 million for every child that we divert from the criminal justice system. Painted a picture of the school system. I've painted a picture of the prison system. So a question you may have is, why a rite of passage? Why is a rite of passage an answer to this problem? So I just want to pose this question. When you hear this term, rite of passage, what comes to mind?